Welcome to the Movement series, where we explore one book, one chapter at a time to ignite fresh vision for disciple-making movements around the world. I'm Isa, and this season, we're walking through Spent Matches by Roy Moran, a bold call to rethink church and re-engage the mission of Jesus in a radically practical way. Whether you're a seasoned leader or just starting your journey, this series will challenge and inspire you to step into the movement God is already stirring. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Movement series. Today, we're kicking off a deep dive into a source called Spent Matches. We're really focusing in on the first chapter.
Yeah, the very beginning. And it really sets the stage, doesn't it? It lays out what the author calls some pretty brutal facts.
Brutal facts. Sounds intense. About what the effectiveness of how we're currently trying to spread the good news.
Exactly. Or maybe the lack of effectiveness.
Yeah.
The source isn't really about giving totally new information. It's more like a reminder, a confrontation with reality, things we might kind of feel but haven't really grappled with.
Okay, so the mission today is to unpack that initial setup. It might challenge some assumptions, maybe feel a bit uncomfortable, but we want to quickly pull out the key insights for you right from the start of this book.
Let's do it. The author doesn't waste any time at all. Right away, the core argument is, look, despite seeing growth, maybe even feeling like things are going well, there's this uncomfortable truth that globally, the church is becoming, well, less effective, especially when you measure it against how fast the world's population is growing.
Less effective. Hang on. We always hear the story, right? Started with 120. Now there's, 2.3 billion Christians? That sounds like massive success.
And that growth is real, absolutely. It's something to celebrate. But the source immediately brings in this idea, the Stockdale Paradox.
Right. Admiral Stockdale, a POW in Vietnam.
Yeah.
You keep faith, you'll get out eventually.
At the same time,
You absolutely have to confront the brutal facts of your current situation day to day. No sugarcoating.
exactly. And the author applies that directly to ministry leadership. The argument is we can sometimes overuse optimism. We believe the gospel wins in the end, which we should. But that belief can sometimes stop us from having the discipline to look squarely at the difficult facts right now.
So focusing on the amazing, life-changing stories in my local church, which are totally real and important, that could actually be a way of avoiding the bigger picture.
It could be almost a defense mechanism, yeah. The source argues that only looking at those anecdotes, powerful as they are, can kind of shield us from seeing the global trends, the national trends that might show our strategies aren't working as well as we think. And that prevents learning, prevents adjusting.
The numbers the author uses to back this up, they're pretty sober.
They really are. Okay, so yes, Christians are about 33% of the world now. But think about this. In 1900, there was about 1 billion people who hadn't heard the gospel. 1 billion without Christ today, that number is over 4 billion.
4 billion today versus 1 billion back then. That really reframes progress, doesn't it? The absolute number of people we're trying to reach has actually quadrupled, even if the percentage grew.
Totally reframes it. And then look at the annual increase in Christians, about 55 million total.
Yeah.
Dig deeper. 42 million of those are kids born into Christian families. Biological growth.
Right.
Only about 19 million are actual converts, people coming to faith from outside.
19 million converts a year globally. I mean, that still sounds like a lot.
It does on the surface.
Yeah.
But as a percentage of the global population, it's tiny, like 0.27%. The source asks, kind of pointedly, can God only use 2.3 billion followers to bring 19 million people out of over 7 billion to himself each year? It forces you to question the effectiveness of our methods at scale.
Cost. You mentioned cost. The figures cited are just, whoa. Like a projected cost of $1.4 million to baptize one person globally by 2025.
Yeah, and even a U.S. figure from back in 2001 was $1.5 million per baptism. Staggering.
And the point isn't that a soul isn't worth it.
No, of course not. The value is infinite. The question is about strategy and sustainability. Are the methods we're using financially sustainable or scalable enough to actually address reaching those 4 billion people? It's a brutal financial reality check.
And this isn't just an issue elsewhere. The source pulls in U.S. data, too, referencing Christine Wicker's work on American evangelicalism.
Right. Suggesting that despite the narrative, key things like conversions, baptisms, giving, attendance, they're actually in decline in the U.S. evangelical sphere.
Wicker apparently called the idea of evangelicals taking over a publicity scam hiding losses. Ouch.
Yeah. And combine that with the huge rise of the Naterns, the religiously unaffiliated, especially younger adults.
1 in 5 Americans overall, but 1 in 3 adults under 30. And they attend church way less than older generations.
These are the trends the source says threaten the future. It's so easy to focus on the good things in our church, our community, and we should, but refusing to look at these bigger, harder facts, well, it hinders our ability to adapt.
It makes those cautionary tales the author include hit harder,
So,
like the Swiss watchmakers inventing the quartz watch.
but sticking with mechanical ones, form over function, classic mistake. They missed the boat.
Or the tragic example of Rwanda. So many Christians, yet tribal identity tragically proved stronger for many during the genocide. Faith didn't penetrate deep enough, apparently.
A truly sobering reality check.
And even something like the Bibliotheca Bible Project, that huge Kickstarter success for just the plain biblical text, it suggests people might still be hungry for the Bible itself.
But maybe not for all the traditional church structures or packaging we've put around it.
Yeah, it's a really strong opening chapter, basically forcing you to ask, are we really effective? Or are we maybe clinging to a success story that doesn't quite match the reality on the ground?
And once you start grappling with those numbers, those brutal facts, the next question is inevitable, isn't it? Why are we in this situation?
Right, which is where the source starts challenging some really fundamental assumptions about mission itself.
It goes straight for the Great Commission, Matthew 28, go and make disciples.
Okay, how does it challenge that?
Well, the argument is we've often treated it as a two-step process. Step 1, evangelism, get a decision. Step 2, discipleship, teach them stuff.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Evangelism, then discipleship.
But the source points out the Greek word for go isn't just a command to depart. It's more like a participle, meaning as you are going or just going.
Huh. So it's not primarily about launching a special evangelism event or mission trip. It's about disciple making being woven into the fabric of everyday life for everyone.
Exactly. It's embedded. It's ongoing. It's for all followers. And that understanding really underpins this key principle the book hammers home. Form follows function.
Form follows function. Okay, unpack that.
Think about the early church in Acts. What was their core function? Making disciples who made disciples, multiplying rapidly. And their form grew out of that function, meeting in homes, simple structures, adapt.
Function came first.
Right. The source argues that a lot of modern ministry flips that. We start with the form, planting a church, building the organization, getting the programs running.
And then we hope that disciple-making disciples somehow emerge from that structure.
Exactly. And the brutal fact, the source suggests, is that simply planting the form of a church doesn't automatically produce the function of multiplying disciple-making disciples. Sometimes the form can even get in the way.
Which connects to the author's critique of the word church itself.
It does, pointing out that the New Testament uses ecclesia, meaning assembly, gathering the people. But that got widely replaced by church, which has roots in words meaning like house of the Lord, Kirch in German.
So the focus shifted subtly from the people gathered for a purpose to the building or the institution.
That's the argument. It led to seeing church as a place you go to, an organization you belong to, rather than the people who are the church, mobilized for mission. It creates heavier, more static structures.
More dependent on buildings, budgets, professional staff.
Precisely. Less agile, less reliant on the spirit moving through ordinary people. There's that provocative quote from a Kenyan friend mentioned, "You gave us the virus of building-centric ministry, now bring the antivirus." It suggests the Western model hasn't always helped.
So if it's not about the building or the complex organization, what's the bare minimum, the core function that defines a church, according to this source?
Super simple, based on function. A group that obeys God, connects with one another, and disciples the world.
Obey, connect, disciple. That's really stripped down.
It is. And the source argues we in the West have become maximalist. We build these elaborate systems for everything, committees, programs, detailed curricula.
Before we've even ensured the basic DNA is there, the actual disciple-making part.
Yeah, like trying to build a whole skeleton before you have the living cells that know how to replicate. We focus on the structure, the form, maybe before the core function is healthy and multiplying.
So it's not a lack of trying, maybe, but potentially getting the order wrong, focusing on form over function, and maybe misunderstanding the core command itself.
That's really the heart of the critique in this first chapter. And if that's the diagnosis, you have to ask, okay, what needs to change? How do we reimagine things?
Which leads into rethinking leadership, how people learn, how we actually do ministry day to day.
Absolutely. The traditional leader as expert at the front model gets challenged. Jesus seemed to intend leaders who lead from behind, right? Catalysts and powers, people who equip others and let the movement spread beyond them.
Not being the bottleneck or the indispensable guru.
Exactly. And this connects directly to the critique of religious titles and hierarchy. Pastor, elder, deacon used as status markers.
Right, creating layers, dependency.
The source argues it can create a kind of caste system, clergy versus laity, which might even go against Jesus in Matthew 23, saying, "Call no man master, teacher, father on earth." The idea being these are functions people perform, not permanent titles conferring special status or authority.
So it's not that teaching or leading or serving are bad, but turning them into titles that create divisions and dependency is the problem.
That's the crux of it. That dependency on human intermediaries, it's a major theme.
Like needing the expert to tell you what the Bible means or what God wants you to do.
Yeah. There's that story about Jennifer and Bob. Jennifer's reading the Bible on her own, feels God telling her clearly to leave this unhealthy relationship.
And she just does it without needing confirmation or interpretation from a pastor.
Right. It illustrates that God can speak directly through his word and people can respond without needing a human expert to mediate everything. It challenges that dependency model.
Okay, so if you're in a traditional leadership role, this requires a pretty big shift in how you see yourself.
A huge shift from being the primary source of information and persuasion to becoming what the source calls a learning designer.
A learning designer. Explain that.
The idea is people commit more fully to conclusions they reach themselves. So instead of just telling people what to think, your role shifts to designing experiences or asking questions that help people engage with the truth and make meaning for themselves. You guide the discovery process.
Less, here's the answer. More, here's a good question to wrestle with in the text.
Precisely. It's a subtle but profound shift. And it ties into another critique, that we often focus discipleship on knowledge transfer, teach them all things about the Bible, rather than obedience, teach them to obey all things.
The classic kid saying, I know, when you tell them to clean their room, but they don't actually do it.
Yeah.
Knowing isn't doing.
Exactly. Accumulating knowledge without that immediate focus on application, on obedience, doesn't necessarily lead to transformation or multiplication. The source also touches on, Western thinking, loving analysis, breaking things down, versus a more biblical Hebrew approach of synthesis, integrating truth into life. Too much analysis without synthesis doesn't change lives.
So the challenge is deep. It's about rethinking our core purpose, our roles, even how we think learning happens.
It really is. And if we're going to try different ways, we probably need different tools, right? Different kinds of maps and compasses for the journey.
The source uses that Terry Moore TED Talk analogy about tying your shoes differently. We get these ingrained habits, even spiritual ones.
That feel totally normal, maybe even efficient, but maybe they're not actually the best way. And we need to be willing to rethink them.
So for people exploring faith or new believers, they need help navigating a map and a compass, the source says.
Right. An outline of the journey and something pointing them consistently to God. And it introduces the 7 journeys idea as a kind of map.
But it's described as a digital map, not analog.
Yeah, like a CD versus a cassette tape. Analog, you have to go start to finish. Digital, you can jump straight to the track, the journey. That's most relevant right now.
So these 7 journeys aren't necessarily sequential steps everyone has to master in order.
That's the key. There's shifts in relationship, defined by verbs. Earner to heir, obey, rebel to obedient, share, receiver to giver, relate, isolation to community, serve, consumer to producer, give, charitable to extravagant, and disciple, traveler to guide. You might be working on several at once.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do people actually use the Bible to navigate these without falling back on the human expert?
That's where the discovery process comes in. It's presented as a simple, repeatable way for groups to engage Scripture together, hear from God, and figure out obedience.
Simple and repeatable. What does it look like?
Usually starts with checking in needs, celebrations, then reading the passage, maybe twice, then asking really open observation questions. What stands out? What do you like? What bothers you? What does it say about God? What does it say about people or life?
Questions anyone can engage with, not requiring seminary training.
Exactly. The goal is for everyone to see what the text says. Then the crucial steps. I will. Each person identifies a specific, concrete step of obedience based on the passage.
Connecting knowing to doing again.
Right. And then, who can you share this with? Committing to pass on what they learn or their obedience step. It keeps it outward focused. The Bible is the authority, God's Spirit is the teacher, the facilitator is just a guide.
And there's also the 3-column study for personal use. Copy, rephrase, obey, share.
Yeah, just reinforcing that same pattern of engagement and application. And critically, the whole approach emphasizes multiplication of groups, not just growth within groups.
Starting new groups, not just getting bigger. Why is that distinction important?
Because the simple, reproducible discovery process works best in smaller settings. Large groups often start needing more structure, more central teaching, recreating the dependencies the source argues against. The goal is replication, like cells dividing, not just one cell getting enormous.
Wow. Okay, so putting any of this into practice, it's clearly not just about learning a new technique. It requires some deep internal shifts in how we think.
Totally. The source talks about that standard transformation cycle. Unconscious incompetence. You don't know you're bad at it. Conscious incompetence. You realize you're bad. Ouch. Conscious competence. You can do it if you're really focused. Unconscious competence. It's second nature, like learning to drive on the other side of the road.
Yeah, your old habits suddenly become dangerous. And that middle stage, conscious incompetence, realizing you're not as good as you thought, that's tough.
That's the hurdle. And it connects to the Dunning-Kruger effect. People who are unskilled often overestimate their skill because they don't know enough to know they're unskilled. Spiritually, if we're ineffective at making disciples, we might not even realize it. As Epictetus said, it is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. You have to get past that.
So, to wrap up this first chapter's message, what are those core mindset shifts the source is really pushing for? Can you recap those?
Yeah, the source lists quite a few, pulling it all together. It's moving from evangelizing to conversion, towards discipling to conversion, from knowledge-focused discipleship towards obedience-focused discipleship, from just making disciples towards making disciples, from relying on the qualified few towards releasing the willing many, from simple reproduction towards true replication, from being worried about what I'm saying towards being more concerned with what they're thinking and discovering, from telling people what to think towards suggesting what they should be thinking about in the Word, from measuring inputs like attendance towards measuring outcomes like obedience and multiplication, from seeing yourself as the communicator towards seeing yourself as a learning designer, and from wanting to be more radical towards being maybe irrationally committed to being simple and reproducible.
That's a powerful list. It really captures the essence of the paradigm shift being proposed. It's not minor tweaking.
Not at all. And the source suggests, look, this kind of radical change often doesn't start at the top of big institutions. It starts small, maybe out on the fringes, with people willing to try something different.
Okay, so this first chapter of Spent Matches definitely throws down a gauntlet. It presents the hard numbers, confronts the effectiveness issue head-on, and challenges a lot of our standard operating procedures and even our leadership assumptions.
Yeah, it argues pretty strongly that maybe our traditional forms and habits, even if well-intentioned, are holding us back from the core function of making multiplying disciples at the scale needed.
And it really sets the stage for exploring these alternative approaches later in the book, emphasizing simplicity, obedience, and multiplication, but underlining that getting there requires some significant internal mind shifts first.
Makes you really question, what are we actually measuring? Activity? Attendance? Or are we seeing genuine, reproducing, obedient disciples being formed?
Which leaves a big question for you listening, doesn't it? Faced with these brutal facts and the scale of the challenge laid out here, how willing are you to honestly assess current realities and maybe explore some very different maps and compasses for the journey ahead?
Definitely something to think about as we conclude this first look into Spent Matches.
Thanks for joining us on the Movement series.
Thanks for joining us on the Movement series. If today's conversation stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter as we continue walking through Spent Matches by Roy Moran. Until next time, keep leaning into the mission, because movements start when ordinary people say yes to an extraordinary God. To get connected and learn more, visit newgenerations.network.